Thank you for watching Grassroots Television. Visit grassrootstv.org for on-demand community archive footage, as well as educational, inspiring, and entertaining local programming. Your contribution allows us to bring a voice to the Valley and to preserve media that has been a part of the community since 1972. Visit grassrootstv.org and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, and Twitter. The following program, Letting the Stranger In, is generously underwritten by the Jewish Community Center Shabbat in Aspen, as well as the Fund for Interfaith Understanding. Enjoy, and again, thank you for tuning in to Grassroots Community Network.
And now Dr. Ira Bledsoe, who I think is going to stand.
No, I am. I actually think better on my feet. It's just easier for me. And if I run around, I apologize for that as well. Before I start, I just want to say how lucky I am to be part of this panel and part of this conference. I've learned a lot, and there's a lot that I'm gonna bring back with me. I also, in this talk that I'm going to give, slightly different than maybe some of the others, I want to talk about Emmanuel Levinas and letting the stranger in. But in considering Levinas and considering Levinas's philosophy, I don't want you to consider what Levinas tells you in terms of what to think, but I want you to consider Levinas' philosophy in terms of how to think about encountering the stranger and letting the stranger in. So in the time that we have, I'm going to hopefully do three things. One, I'm going to briefly introduce Levinas' philosophy. I will then say how it relates to letting in the stranger or the other. And then I'll give some practical lessons that we can take away from his philosophy. So first, in terms of a brief introduction, Emmanuel Levinas was a Jewish French philosopher, born in 1906, died in 1995, who wrote extensively on Jewish philosophy, ethics, existentialism, phenomenology, and ontology. Now those are a lot of big words, and the importance of mentioning all of those big words is to situate Levinas's philosophical motivations into a broader discussion of interests. Knowing that his philosophy fits into these different fields can allow you to understand what he's trying to do, what he's trying to teach us. It's kind of like having the title of a talk or the title of a book give you or indicate to you a little bit about what the book or the talk is going to be about. So let's break these words down a little bit. So first off, ontology. Ontology is the philosophical study of the nature of being, becoming, existence, and reality. It tries to understand the basic categories of what exists and the relationship of those things that exist. It deals with questions of how things can be grouped, how things are related in a hierarchy, how things are subdivided in terms of similarities and differences. It's the study of reality. Existentialism, or existentialists share the belief that philosophical thinking begins with the human subject. Not merely a thinking subject, but an acting, feeling, and living individual. Phenomenology is the philosophical study of the structures of experience and consciousness. In particular, it attempts to ground that subjective experience, such as judgments, perceptions, emotions, into objective reflection. All right, that's a lot. So in less technical terms, what are we trying to do here? Like what is Levinas trying to do? Levinas wants to understand the world around him. He wants to know what exists, how it came to be, how things relate to each other. Importantly is what he wants to understand are not simply objects, but ideas and communities as well as objects. In other words, Levinas recognizes that it's not only the physical world around us that should be the subject of philosophical examination. The social world around us is just as important for philosophy. Moreover, reality is more than just the natural world. The social world that we create is as real as the physical world around us. Yet Levinas realizes that in order to know what exists around him, he must recognize that his understanding of the world is not some objective view from nowhere. He knows the world through his own experiences, and his experiences are pregnant not only with how he thinks rationally or the rational aspect of his thoughts on the world, but how he feels emotionally and what judgments he has about the world around him, how those judgments, how those emotions, how those feelings influence his own understanding. So for him, for Levinas, in order to understand the world, he must first come to terms with how he himself affects that understanding. In other words, to look out, he must first look in. This goes to the idea of self-alienation or the stranger in oneself. If you keep that which influences you or affects you as something strange or something hidden or something that is not open to your own reflection, the perversion of what you see of yourself will reflect or project itself on the perversion of how you see the world. So if you really want to try and understand the world, you really need to understand from where you're coming as well. So now that we see how he engages in ontology, phenomenology, existentialism, how does this make him a Jewish philosopher? Right? I mean, he understands the world. So Levinas is not simply a philosopher who's Jewish, to make him a Jewish philosopher. His philosophy is grounded in the Jewish tradition. But his conception of Jewish philosophy is not apologetics, nor is it an explanation of Jewish religious concepts or ideals. His is not a philosophy of Judaism. So as a Jewish philosophy, his understanding is that he knows that if he must look inward at himself in order to understand the world, he recognizes that he himself is also not an island. His experiences are shaped by his tradition, and he must engage and wrestle with his tradition in order to appreciate how he himself fits into it. He sees the world through his own Jewish eyes. This last point is actually quite powerful when thinking about engaging the stranger, and is relevant to this conference, because it forces us to contend with the notion that we see the world, we all see the world through our own eyes. But those eyes are solely not of our own making. We are all just another rung on a very long chain, which, though a rung on its own accord, is nevertheless a part of a chain which it's attached. Recognizing the fact will allow us both to affirm our own vision, but it also makes us or forces us to appreciate that others may not see things the same way. The key is not to come to mutual understanding or a common vision. It is to respect the different visions that each one has, to know from where it originates, and to appreciate the differences without saying that everything is relative. This is another form of letting the stranger in. Since Levinas and his philosophy demands that the stranger is not an opponent of one's own worldview, but is rather another lens through which to see the world. Whether one chooses to let the stranger in or not, Levinas's philosophy demands that we cannot ignore that stranger. We can only accept his or her presence or rejection of it. Okay, so now where does the ethics fit in? Like, this seems to be getting broader and broader. So it really depends on how you look or how you define ethics, right? Today, we tend to think of ethics as an external set of norms to which we must comply, as if there's a right or wrong answer that we either recognize and follow or we don't. Yet that view of ethics is both very modern and very limited. Ethics, as a broader field of study, examines not only how decisions could be judged in terms of whether they're right or wrong or good or bad, but it also examines the values by which one understands a given situation and on which decisions are made. And as Jane discussed, it studies how people's habits and perceptions are influenced by and influence the values they hold dear. And it looks at how people's characters are shaped by how they interact in the world. So Levinas recognizes that ethics is not simply a field of ontology. It's not something that just normally exists that we recognize like objects or ideas. Right? He challenges us to see the relationship between how ethics exists in the world with how people act ethically in the world. Moreover, those moral actions are dependent on people's experiences and emotions and judgments that they carry with them. It's part of not only his ontology, but his phenomenology and his existentialism. The study of ethics is not a subject within his understanding of reality. It's part and parcel of his process of understanding reality itself. And let me give you an example, because this seems to be a little bit opaque, if you will. So Levinas writes, to understand a tool is not to see it, but to know how to use it. To understand our situation in reality is not to define it, but to be in an effective state, by which he means to have feelings about it and to be aroused to do something about it. For him, to think is not to contemplate, but to be engaged. Because our views of ethics and morality are tied to our motivations, our emotions, our beliefs, and our actions in the world, each informs and obligates the other. For example, if a belief makes us feel good, we tend to be less motivated to disprove it, and we are more motivated to act on it. Similarly, if being with a person makes us feel good, like at this conference, we tend to be less critical of their faults and we try to spend as much time with them as we can. Now, that seems to be both similar and very different at the same time. Here I'm talking about hanging out with people, and before I was talking about hanging out or grasping onto beliefs, but the form in which that takes is exactly the same. The emotional attachment relates to beliefs and actions, and they reinforce each other. By the way, this isn't only in French philosophy and Levinas, but you see this in William James's pragmatism, you see this in psychology, you see this in habitation and character development. The way we feel, the way we think, and the way we act are always going to be tied to each other. But there's another part of Levinas's ethics that I think is very essential to understanding his philosophy. Because ethics includes the motivation to engage in moral thinking and moral behavior, understanding the world or the other cannot be separated from interacting with the world or the other. To know the world or to know the other is to hold the other in a moral embrace. As Levinas puts it, the other is not first an object of understanding and then an interlocutor, or someone with whom one converses. The relations are merged. In other words, addressing the other is inseparable from understanding the other. So what does this mean? Right? Think of his statements in terms of human interaction. Levinas correctly writes that humans are the only beings that one cannot meet without expressing that meeting itself. Right? In every attempt to meet someone, there contains an opportunity to greet him or her. Even the refusal of greeting that person communicates the other's own understanding of him or her. In greeting that person, one is forced to understand that this person is not simply an object, a concept, an idea to be possessed, but a person to be encountered. Think about it. We do not greet objects. We greet people. So therefore, regardless of any political or physical power one person may have over another, any proper understanding of other human beings demands that we see them, we know them, we engage them, not as part of oneself, this is mine, my understanding, right? But it's as we see them, we greet them, we encounter them as another who cannot be negated. In this moment, the relationship between two beings are created, which in and of itself is ethical in nature. So let me give you a good example of how he sees this relationship not as completely self-imposing or self-reflecting. So Levinas recognizes the other as independent while in relation when he says the we is not the plural of the I. Now think about that. Right? A community of individuals is no longer homogeneous or a conflated super I, where the collective has lost the particularities of the individual for the sake of the greater whole. Or more importantly, the community is not a reflection of any one person or any individual's desires. The we is now something new. It's something different than many I's. Of course, there must be respect for the individuality of the many I's, yet also an obligation for each other in a different form, in the form of the we. So now, we talk in philosophy a lot of times about what this respect and this communal engagement looks like. And for Levinas, it's very different than both the Kantian deontological view of respect or even in Martin Buber's description of the I-thou relationship. And when you see this, it looks like the way you engage and encounter and let the other in has a very visceral type of form. So for Kant, and he writes this in his groundwork in the Metaphysics of Morals, he shows that respect for the other is mediated through the moral law or the categorical imperative. So here there's a similarity because the categorical imperative is a self-legislating will or results from a self-legislating will. So it comes from, my respect from the other comes from the obligation I put upon myself, right? But the way Kant looks at the respect for the other is a demonstration of one's own willingness to adhere and to identify with the universal moral law. Right? Which means that the primary respect that Kant wants you to show is respect to the moral code or to the moral principle, which then gets carried out into respect to the person. For Levinas, the encounter itself demands, or the understanding itself demands the encounter and the respect to the other person. It's also different from Martin Buber's I and thou, because in the I-thou relationship, as opposed to an I-it relationship, the relationship itself has each person demanding upon each other, right? So when I see someone as a thou, as a you, as a person, as opposed to as an object, that person then obligates me, and I obligate them. For Levinas, while the relationship may have that component, it doesn't originate, or the obligations don't originate in the relationship. For Levinas, the relationship starts through the understanding. And the way he says it is, which is amazing to me, he says, when I encounter the other, I command the other to command me. Right? Which means that regardless of what the other person does, my engagement or my letting in the other itself is a self-imposed obligation to have that other person impose upon me. Right? When you think of, and we talked about this in terms of human rights, right? This fits very well with the concept, or the Jewish concept, that duties precede rights. So if you look at the way in the creation story how Adam was created and then names the animals and so forth, God commands him 6 commandments, right? Not to steal, not to curse God, not to worship idols, not to murder, create courts of justice, and so forth, right? Meaning that his obligations to humanity are not because humanity has rights, but because they have rights because he has obligations to them. Right? When, after the flood, Noah gets a further commandment of not eating from a live animal, there you see animal rights isn't because animals have rights, but because humans have duties to them. It's in that encounter with the other, I'm forcing myself to have you command me. Right? Now, this is really actually quite important, because what it does is, when you look at human rights from an axiological or motivational perspective, I also have rights. You have rights, I have rights. So for me to respect your rights, the onus is on you or the other to persuade me to act on them, or to be moved by them, right? But when I look at it as rights as consequent of duties, the onus isn't on the other to persuade me to respect him or her, right? I'm motivated by my own duty claims, not by the rights claims, right? So Levinas makes a lot of sense when you're looking at it between two people. But then how does this work, or how does Levinas' concept of the other and the ethical relate to social justice? Right? So Levinas doesn't really speak about justice between two people. Right? That relationship is separate from what we consider justice. Right? His theory of justice arises when we have the recognition of the third person. This recognition of the third other, or the third person, forces each person within that dialogical relationship to then appreciate the limits that they have that any other can have on anyone else. Justice is a recognition of the finitude within human capacity of relationship. What do I mean by that? Being responsible for one other and then another other has a consequence of that I have less ability to fulfill my responsibilities to one versus the other. It's if you notice, the preference or the priority or the perspective is always on what is my ability to fulfill another's needs. Right? This is very different than social contract theory and the way democracies have philosophically been justified. Because if you look at Rawlsian or any other type of liberal or contractual descriptions of justice, it's always about how can I be secure of my own needs and the expressions of my own liberty, given the finitude of resources or given the needs of others. So therefore, I will create a society where I can be in the best position that I can be, regardless of what position I'm in. Right? It's, again, the we as really an extension of the I. For Levinas, social justice doesn't work like that at all. Right? For him, the community or the justice is not about the me, it's about the you or the other, and how my just simply beginning to understand that others exist in the world, what that means in terms of my being imposed upon me of fulfilling their needs and their desires and the commandments that they put on me. So that's a lot. So if we can just come out with 3 practical lessons that can help us in terms of understanding Levinas' philosophy, which I hope we all spend more time with and we learn about on our own. But how can this help us today practically? So first, we should immediately recognize that any thoughts about the stranger or the other immediately and inseparably include our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own habits, our own biases, and how those influence the way we can even begin to see or understand the other. Second, any advance in knowledge of the stranger entails greeting the stranger, the letting the stranger in. And this isn't cognitive. This isn't political. This is moral in nature. You can't know about someone separately from knowing someone. Knowing someone is the primary. And then what's the third? The moral obligations we have to the stranger are not based on their reciprocity. Right? I don't owe the stranger because the stranger owes me. Right? It's independent, our obligation, or our moral encounter of the stranger is independent of how the stranger greets us in return. Right? Similarly, these obligations to the stranger is not part of some universal maxim to which we all comply and self-legislate. Right? They come from the encounter of the other itself. So this last point I want to just tease a little bit, because you may say that, well, once the stranger encounters us in a way that is dangerous or harmful, then that relationship breaks up. Well, that's actually not true, right? But neither is the encounter of the stranger or the obligation of the stranger self-effacing love. It's not simply a turning the other cheek completely, right? What it does mean is that everyone has a face. Everyone is a person. Dehumanizing the other is very different than protecting oneself from the harms of another's violent encounter. So when we look at both in terms of our self-protection, our social justice, our understanding of the world, we have to recognize that we don't come and think about it and then act. We come and immerse ourselves in it and then become engaged. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Grassroots Television. Visit grassrootstv.org for on-demand community archive footage, as well as educational, inspiring, and entertaining local programming. Your contribution allows us to bring a voice to the Valley and to preserve media that has been a part of the community since 1972. Visit grassrootstv.org and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, and Twitter. The following program, Letting the Stranger In, is generously underwritten by the Jewish Community Center Shabbat in Aspen, as well as the Fund for Interfaith Understanding. Enjoy, and again, thank you for tuning in to Grassroots Community Network.